The camera opens on a dimly lit Paris apartment. May 1982. A glass of wine stands half-finished on a bedside table. A cigarette still smolders in the ashtray, its thin line of smoke curling toward the ceiling. Inside lies Romy Schneider, only 43 years old, her body lifeless, her beauty untouched by time, yet clouded by despair. Newspapers would soon call it a mystery death, some whispering overdose, others insisting her heart simply gave out. But for those who knew her, the truth was far more tragic. Romy had been carrying the unbearable weight of loss, betrayal, and the relentless demands of fame for far too long. To the world, Romy Schneider was eternal youth. She was Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sissi, a fairy tale princess who embodied innocence, grace, and romantic ideals. Generations grew up watching her smile radiate from cinema screens, believing in the fantasy she projected. But behind the curtains of the set, Romy despised the role that made her immortal. That image of the perfect princess became her golden cage, locking her inside a version of herself that the public wanted, while denying her the right to be seen as anything else. The world loved Sissi. Romy, the woman, was left to drown in silence. Her life reads like a Greek tragedy. Born into an acting dynasty, with a mother who had once basked in Nazi-era fame, Romy carried scars that could not be erased. The shadow of her mother's choices haunted her, and so did the burden of expectation. Every role she took, every romance she lived, every betrayal she endured, seemed written as if by fate itself, a fate determined not to let her escape suffering. Her passionate love affair with Alain Delon ended in heartbreak that marked her forever. Years later, her young son David would die in a horrifying accident, a loss from which Romy never recovered. When death finally came for her, it felt less like an intruder and more like a release. But let us not rush to the end. To understand Romy Schneider, we must first confront the paradox that defined her existence. She was adored by millions, yet perpetually lonely. She was the princess of Europe, yet lived as a restless exile. She was both dazzlingly strong on screen and devastatingly fragile in private. Hers is not a story about stardom, but about the cruelty of being trapped between myth and reality. Imagine being 19, stepping into a role that would make you the face of a generation. Overnight, Romy's image as Sissi spread across Europe like wildfire. She became a household name, a national treasure. Yet, instead of freeing her, the success suffocated her. Directors, producers, and audiences alike wanted her to remain the sweet, innocent princess forever. They refused to let her grow up, to take risks, to explore the darker depths of her artistry. And Romy, fiercely ambitious and desperate to prove herself, began rebelling against the very machine that had built her. Her rebellion was not quiet. It came in the form of scandalous choices, leaving Germany for France, embracing roles that stripped away her purity, aligning herself with filmmakers who wanted to break her porcelain image. It came in the form of fiery romances, most famously with Alain Delon, who gave her both passion and betrayal in equal measure. And yet, beneath it all, she remained vulnerable, longing not just to be loved, but to be understood. By the late 1970s, the cracks in her life had widened into unbridgeable chasms. Alcohol and medication blurred her nights. Headlines mocked her fragility. Her son's death shattered what little was left of her spirit. And still, she kept working, pouring her grief into performances that critics hailed as masterpieces. It is as if Romy Schneider only found truth on screen when pretending to be someone else. In front of the camera, she was alive. Behind it, she was disappearing. The image of Romy at the end of her life is haunting. Her once luminous eyes dulled by sorrow, her laughter replaced by silence. Yet in that silence lies the key to her story. She was not simply a fallen star, not merely another tragic headline. Romy Schneider's life is the mirror of what happens when the world demands perfection but refuses to see the humanity behind it. Her tragedy was not her fame. Her tragedy was that she could never escape it. This is not a tale about an actress who died young. This is the tale of a woman who lived too intensely for a world unwilling to embrace her pain. Romy's story is a question that echoes long after her death. How do we love an icon without destroying the person inside? And so, as the curtain rises on her journey, we return to that apartment in Paris. A cigarette burns. A glass of wine stands unfinished. Outside, the city of lights keeps moving, unaware that one of its brightest stars has just been extinguished. But her shadow, fragile, radiant, and unforgettable, lingers. The story of Romy Schneider has only just begun. To understand Romy Schneider's dazzling rise and tragic fall, we must return to the beginning, to a world already marked by shadows long before she was born. On September 23, 1938, Rosemarie Magdalena Albach, later known to the world as Romy Schneider, entered life in Vienna, Austria. Europe was on the brink of catastrophe, with the rumble of war echoing across the continent. Her very first breaths were drawn in a time when history was at its darkest, and those shadows would cling to her family name. Romy was not just any child. She was the heir to a dynasty of performers. Her mother, Magda Schneider, was already a well-known actress, beloved by audiences for her wholesome beauty and cheerful demeanor. Yet, Magda's fame was tainted by her connections to the Nazi regime. Though she would later insist she was merely a professional doing her job, Magda was undeniably one of Adolf Hitler's favorites, frequently invited to his private gatherings at Berghof. For young Romy, this maternal legacy became a heavy cross to bear. It meant that even before she could speak her first words, the specter of politics and complicity was carved into her identity. Her father, Wolf Albach-Reti, was also an actor, a handsome man with a charm that dazzled audiences on stage and screen. But Wolf was unreliable, more committed to his career and pleasures than to his family. When Romy was just a little girl, her parents separated, leaving Magda to raise her daughter alone. That absence, that early fracture, would leave Romy with a gnawing hunger for affection. A hunger that no amount of applause or adoration could ever fill. As a child, Romy was sent to boarding school, a decision that might have been practical but felt to her like abandonment. She would later recall feeling isolated, torn between the glamorous world of her mother's fame and the loneliness of being a child raised more by institutions than by warmth. The contradiction defined her earliest years. Adored by millions as Magda's daughter, yet privately longing for the steady, unconditional love that never fully arrived. Still, even in childhood, Romy's talent was undeniable. She possessed a radiance that seemed to glow from within, a pair of expressive eyes that could command attention without a word. When she was cast in her first role at the age of 15, in the film When the White Lilacs Bloom, again, 1953, alongside her mother, the world noticed. Critics remarked not only on her beauty, but on her emotional depth, something far beyond her years. Audiences felt an authenticity in Romy, as if she was not acting but revealing hidden truths. The real turning point came when she was offered the role of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sissi. At just 16, Romy was transformed overnight into a living fairy tale. The trilogy of Sissi films, 1955–1957, became a phenomenon across Europe, cementing her status as the sweetheart of German-speaking cinema. She embodied innocence, purity, and regal charm so convincingly that entire nations fell in love with her. For audiences still recovering from the devastation of war, Romy was more than an actress. She was a symbol of hope, a reminder that beauty and grace could exist in a broken world. But for Romy, the role was already a curse. She despised the way Sissi defined her, trapping her in the role of eternal girlhood. She wanted to grow, to break free, to prove that she was capable of far more than smiling serenely in gowns and tiaras. Yet the image was too powerful, too adored by the masses, to ever let her escape. Even in her teens, Romy was learning the cruel paradox of fame. The very thing that gives you wings will also chain you to the ground. Behind the camera, life was no less complicated. Her relationship with her mother was strained, complicated by Magda's past, and her controlling presence. Magda wanted Romy to be successful, but she also wanted to mold her, to shape her daughter into the version of stardom she herself had once inhabited. For Romy, it often felt like she was being suffocated, her individuality sacrificed on the altar of image and legacy. It was not just the world demanding Romy play a role, it was her own family. There is something haunting in how Romy's childhood mirrored the duality of her later life. On screen, she was adored as Sissi, the perfect princess of Austria. Off-screen, she was the daughter of a mother associated with Hitler, a father who had abandoned her, and a family history shadowed by moral compromise. The dissonance between fantasy and reality was present from the very beginning, planting the seeds of a lifelong struggle between the woman she was and the image she was forced to uphold. Yet, for all its fractures, her childhood also gave her resilience. Growing up in the ruins of post-war Europe, Romy developed a fierce determination. She learned to hide pain behind a smile, to channel loneliness into performance, to transform wounds into art. That ability, born of necessity, would later make her one of the most magnetic actresses of her generation. But it also meant that she never fully escaped the child within the girl abandoned at school, the daughter of a compromised mother, the teenager thrust into a crown she did not want to wear. By the time Romy reached adulthood, she was both a phenomenon and a prisoner. She was adored, envied, celebrated. Yet she was already longing for escape from her past, from her family, from Sissi, and even from the country that could not see her as anything more than a fairy tale empress. That longing would drive her to make a fateful choice, to leave the comfort of German cinema for the unknown of France. It was there, in Paris, that Romy Schneider would begin the second act of her life, one filled with passion, artistic triumph, betrayal, and heartbreak. The child of Vienna, born in the shadow of war, raised by a mother stained by history, was about to reinvent herself. But reinvention comes at a price, and for Romy Schneider, the price would be everything. By the late 1950s, Romy Schneider was already a household name in Europe, but she was suffocating inside the gilded cage of her own success. The image of Sissi clung to her like a second skin, adored by audiences, but despised by Romy herself. She longed to prove that she was more than a porcelain doll in a tiara, more than a cinematic symbol of innocence. Her ambition burned, and it demanded risk. That risk came in 1958, when a script landed in her hands, a film that would forever change her destiny, both professionally and personally. The movie was Christine, a romantic drama set in Vienna, based on Arthur Schnitzler's play. But what truly captured Romy's attention was not the script, but her co-star, Alain Delon, an unknown young French actor at the time, still years away from becoming the icon he would later be. Their chemistry was instantaneous, electric, undeniable. On set, they became inseparable, their connection transcending the screen. The film itself was modest in success, but the relationship between Romy and Delon ignited a cultural frenzy. Europe could not look away. For Romy, Alain represented escape. He was the opposite of everything she had known in the German film industry. Wild, unpredictable, fiercely independent. He embodied the freedom she craved, the rebellion against convention that she had been suppressing since Sissi. With him, she felt alive, Desired not as a symbol, but as a woman, their love was tempestuous, filled with passion and volatility. Yet it gave Romy the courage to break away from the world that had defined her. In 1963, she made the daring move to Paris, leaving behind Germany, her mother's shadow, and the suffocating expectations of her fans. It was an act of defiance, but also of rebirth. In France, Romy reinvented herself. No longer was she Sissi. She was an actress, serious and ambitious, determined to carve out a new identity. And Paris, with its vibrant film culture and appetite for sophistication, welcomed her with open arms. Her transition was not easy. French critics initially dismissed her as a lightweight, a German starlet clinging to past glory, but Romy was determined to silence them. She studied French obsessively, perfecting her accent until she could act seamlessly in the language. She accepted challenging roles, deliberately choosing projects that pushed her away from her earlier image. Films like The Trial, 1962, directed by Orson Welles, showed her range, but it was her collaborations with French auteurs that cemented her new status. In La Piscine, The Swimming Pool, 1969, opposite Alain Delon once again, Romy delivered a performance that was sultry, complex, and magnetic. The film was a triumph, and it showcased her ability to embody sensuality without losing depth. Audiences who once thought of her only as Sissi were forced to confront the reality. Romy Schneider was no longer a princess. She was a woman, layered, wounded, dangerous, and alive. But while her career was ascending, her personal life remained tumultuous. Her relationship with Alain Delon, though iconic, was riddled with betrayal. He adored her, yet he could not remain faithful. Romy, fiercely devoted, struggled with the wounds of his infidelity. When he eventually left her, it devastated her. Their friendship endured until her death, a testament to the strange, unbreakable thread that tied them together. Romy's courage to leave Germany and embrace France did more than redefine her career. It marked her as a true European star, transcending borders at a time when divisions still lingered after the war. She worked with some of the greatest filmmakers of her generation, from Luchino Visconti to Claude Sautet, crafting performances that critics would later describe as raw, luminous, and deeply human. In films like Les Choses de la Vie, 1970, she had mastered the art of silence, of saying more with her eyes than most actors could with a monologue. Critics began to call her the greatest actress of her time, a title she carried with both pride and a deep, private sense of inadequacy. For Romy, no success could erase the insecurities born in childhood or the wounds inflicted by love. Still, during this period, she was unstoppable. Awards and accolades poured in, and she found herself working alongside legends, earning respect not only for her beauty, but for her discipline and craft. Unlike many actresses of her era, Romy resisted being typecast as a mere ornament. She demanded roles with substance, characters who reflected the messiness of real life. This defiance made her both admired and feared in the industry, a woman who refused to play by the rules. And yet, beneath the triumph, cracks remained. Romy's longing for stability, for a love that could anchor her, led her into marriages that proved fragile. In 1966, she wed German director Harry Mayen, with whom she had her first child, David. But Mayen's jealousy, controlling nature, and violent tendencies poisoned the relationship. Their marriage ended in divorce, leaving Romy once again wounded. She later married her secretary, Daniel Biasini, but even that union could not withstand the storms of her life. By the early 1970s, Romy Schneider was both at the peak of her career and on the precipice of personal chaos. She had escaped the cage of Sissi. She had conquered Paris, She had reinvented herself as one of Europe's most respected actresses. But the price of reinvention was steep. Her search for love, her battle with insecurity, and her constant need to prove herself left her fragile, even as the world saw her as untouchable. Looking back, it is impossible to separate her ascent from her unraveling. Every triumph was laced with pain, every achievement shadowed by loss. Romy Schneider was rising higher than ever. But the higher she climbed, the more dangerous the fall that awaited her. By the mid-1970s, Romy Schneider stood at the summit of European cinema. She was no longer simply the ingenue who once wore a crown in Sissi. She had become the embodiment of raw, modern womanhood on screen. Critics praised her ability to inhabit characters torn by passion, loss, and contradiction. Directors lined up to work with her, captivated not only by her beauty, but by her emotional fearlessness. Romy had reinvented herself so completely that audiences could scarcely remember the porcelain princess of the past. Her breakthrough into mature artistry came with Claude Sautet's Les Choses de la Vie. 1970. The film was a meditation on fate and love, and Romy's performance as Hélène, a woman entangled in an impossible relationship, resonated deeply with audiences. Here was an actress who could portray longing, fragility, and strength in a single glance. French critics, once skeptical of her, now hailed her as one of their own. The César Award nominations followed, and Romy's reputation soared. Her collaborations with Sautet continued. César and Rosalie, 1972, A Simple Story, 1978, films that cemented her as the voice of a generation of women wrestling with independence, heartbreak, and desire in a rapidly changing society. Unlike the distant goddesses of Hollywood, Romy's characters felt accessible, painfully human. Women saw themselves reflected in her struggles. Men were disarmed by the depth of her vulnerability. Romy Schneider was no longer trapped in a fantasy, she was a mirror. And everyone who looked saw a piece of themselves. Recognition came not just from audiences, but from the industry itself. In 1978, she won the César Award for Best Actress for A Simple Story, a performance so intimate that some critics described it as indistinguishable from reality. 2 years later, she would win another César for La Passante du Sans Souci, 1982, making her the first woman to achieve such an honor twice. For Romy, these accolades were bittersweet. On stage, accepting the awards, she radiated gratitude and poise. But offstage, she confessed to friends that no statue, no applause could fill the hollow spaces left inside her. Her fame extended far beyond France. Across Europe, from Berlin to Rome, Romy was regarded as a symbol of sophisticated cinema. Hollywood, too, took notice, though she remained reluctant to chase the American dream. Romy feared being typecast again, reduced to a caricature of foreign exoticism. She preferred the artistic freedom of Europe, where directors allowed her to peel back her soul rather than decorate the screen. This decision gave her integrity, but also limited her financial stability. Romy was never as wealthy as her fame suggested. For her, the work mattered more than the paycheck. At the height of her fame, she was photographed endlessly. Fashion magazines adored her, film festivals celebrated her, and journalists hunted her every word. Yet, in interviews, Romy rarely revealed herself fully. She laughed, she charmed, she deflected. The public saw a radiant star. Few glimpsed the fractures beneath the surface. Friends would later recall that even in moments of triumph, her eyes often betrayed a sadness she could not hide. This duality, luminous on screen, tormented in private, became her defining paradox. As audiences watched her embody characters caught between desire and despair, they did not realize how closely those roles mirrored her own life. Art and reality blurred, until they were almost indistinguishable. The cracks in her private world widened during these years. Her first marriage to Harry Mayan had ended bitterly, scarred by his cruelty. Though she found moments of peace with her second husband, Daniel Biasini, the stability never lasted. She gave birth to her daughter, Sarah, in 1977, a source of light in her increasingly dark life. But Romy's relationships with men continued to falter, often ending in heartbreak or betrayal. Fame had given her adoration from millions, but it had stolen the intimacy she craved from one. Her battles with her own demons grew fiercer. Alcohol became a crutch, medication, a shield against the sleepless nights. She pushed herself relentlessly, accepting roles even when exhaustion threatened to consume her. Acting was both her salvation and her torment. The only place she felt alive, yet the very stage that demanded pieces of her soul she could never reclaim. Still, in the eyes of the world, Romy Schneider was untouchable. On screen, she was magnetic. The woman who could make silence thunderous, who could turn vulnerability into power. At the Cannes Film Festival, crowds gathered just to glimpse her smile. At award ceremonies, her name drew ovations before she even reached the stage. She had achieved what few actresses ever could, not just fame, but respect. She was no longer defined by Sissi, she was Romy Schneider, a force of nature in European cinema. And yet, even at this glittering peak, destiny was already preparing its cruelest act. Behind the applause, Romy was collapsing. The pressure to sustain her image, the relentless scrutiny, the broken relationships, the unhealed wounds of childhood, all of it was eroding her spirit. She once confessed in an interview, "I have everything I ever dreamed of, but inside, I am so empty." It was a chilling prophecy, one that hinted at the tragedies yet to come. The height of Romy Schneider's fame was dazzling, but it was also deceptive. The brighter she shone on screen, the darker her private nights became. Fame had crowned her twice over, once as the eternal princess of Sissi, and again as the greatest actress of her generation. But neither crown brought peace. Both were heavy. Both cut deep. As the 1980s dawned, Romy's star seemed brighter than ever. She had conquered doubt, silenced critics, and carved her name into cinematic history. But no one, not even Romy herself, could have foreseen how quickly that brilliance would be consumed by the shadows of tragedy. If the 1970s had crowned Romy Schneider as Europe's most luminous star, the late decade and early 1980s would strip her of every illusion she had fought to preserve. It was as if the gods, jealous of her brilliance, conspired to break her spirit piece by piece. Fame had given her everything, but life was about to take it all away. The first blow came with her marriages. Her union with Harry Mayan had already left her scarred. Behind closed doors, Mayan's cruelty and violent temper turned their household into a battlefield. Though they shared a son, David, the relationship deteriorated into hostility and resentment. When Romy finally found the strength to leave him, it was not liberation but a bitter reprieve. Mayan later took his own life, a tragedy that shook Romy deeply. Though they were divorced, she carried guilt, wondering if she had failed him or if her departure had been the final push into despair. Her second marriage to Daniel Biasini seemed at first like a fresh start. He was younger, devoted, someone she believed might protect her from the storms that followed her. Together, they had a daughter, Sarah, in 1977, bringing Romy rare moments of joy. But even this new chapter could not withstand the weight of her insecurities and the relentless intrusion of fame. The marriage collapsed, leaving Romy once again alone, bruised by disappointment, her search for unconditional love unresolved. Then came the loss that defined her final years, the death of her son, David. In 981, at just 14 years old, he suffered a tragic accident, impaling himself on a fence while trying to climb into his grandparents' home. The news shattered Romy. Friends and colleagues remember her as inconsolable, wandering in a daze, her face drained of life. She never recovered, one confidant said simply. From that day forward, she was gone. David had been her anchor, the one pure love she could count on. His absence left a void too vast to fill. Romy spiraled into despair, her grief spilling into every aspect of her life. She drank heavily, her once radiant appearance ravaged by sorrow. Work, once her refuge, became unbearable. Yet, paradoxically, she continued to act, pouring her pain into performances so raw they bled on screen. Her César-winning turn in La Passante du Sans Souci, 1982, was not simply acting, it was Romy living out her grief before an audience. The line between character and self had disappeared. Scandal clung to her like smoke. The press hounded her, speculating about her drinking, her mental health, her alleged affairs. Photographs of her looking frail and exhausted filled tabloids, erasing the image of the radiant beauty she once projected. Journalists who once praised her talent now feasted on her suffering, turning her into a spectacle of decline. Romy, already fragile, felt hunted. She once remarked bitterly, "The press wants me to bleed, and I give them blood." Friends tried to intervene, but Romy resisted help. She withdrew from those who cared for her, hiding behind alcohol and medication, retreating into solitude. Her Paris apartment became both sanctuary and prison, a place where she could escape the outside world, but never escape herself. Those who visited spoke of rooms filled with silence, curtains drawn against the light, a woman pacing like a shadow of her former self. Despite the chaos, Romy remained fiercely committed to her children. After David's death, she clung desperately to her daughter Sarah, the only reason she could find to endure. Yet even motherhood could not heal her broken heart. The guilt consumed her: guilt for David, guilt for her failed marriages, guilt for her inability to be the flawless figure the world expected. Every smile she gave in public concealed oceans of grief beneath. There was also the shadow of her mother, Romy Schneider, looming still. Romy's relationship with her had always been fraught, complicated by Magda's Nazi-era legacy and her controlling nature. In her later years, Romy struggled to reconcile the love she felt for her mother with the shame that history had carved into her family name. She once confessed that she could never entirely forgive Magda for thrusting her into the spotlight so young, for binding her to Sissi, and for the absence of true maternal warmth in her childhood. This unresolved tension added yet another layer of torment. The tragedies of Romy Schneider's life created a cruel paradox. Professionally, she was at her peak, winning the most prestigious awards, earning the respect of critics and peers alike. Personally, she was in free fall, consumed by loss and isolation. It was as though fate demanded that her greatest artistic triumphs be paid for in private agony. By the time she reached 1982, Romy's body was failing. Years of drinking and smoking had taken their toll. She looked older than her age, her face etched with sorrow, her once bright eyes dulled. Yet even in decline, she retained a haunting beauty, the kind that spoke not of perfection, but of survival. She carried her scars visibly, and in doing so, she remained magnetic. People could not look away, even as they mourned what had been lost. In her final interviews, Romy oscillated between defiance and despair. At times, she declared herself ready to keep fighting, ready to keep working, insisting that acting was her salvation. At other times, she admitted to being utterly broken, confessing that she no longer had the strength to endure. The contradictions mirrored her life itself, luminous and tragic, adored and alone, celebrated and condemned. The darkness had overtaken Romy Schneider, yet, in the shadows, she continued to shine. If only because her suffering was so achingly human. The world had loved her as a princess, admired her as an actress, and now pitied her as a woman destroyed by loss. The tragedy was not simply that she was falling, it was that everyone watched, powerless to catch her. As spring turned to summer in Paris, whispers grew louder. Romy was not well. Romy was fading. Romy was carrying more pain than any one soul could bear. And all of it was true. The question was not if she would survive the storm, but how much longer she could endure before it consumed her entirely. By 1982, Romy Schneider was a woman living at the edge of endurance. At only 43, her body carried the weight of a lifetime of grief. The brilliant actress who had once embodied vitality and grace now seemed consumed by sorrow, her fragility visible to anyone who saw her. Yet even as she unraveled, Romy refused to surrender entirely. She kept working, kept projecting a facade of resilience, even as her closest friends whispered that she was running out of time. Her days had grown increasingly solitary. In her Paris apartment, she surrounded herself with photographs of her son David, his smiling face haunting her more than it comforted her. Friends described her pacing the rooms at night, clutching his image, weeping until exhaustion forced her into restless sleep. Cigarettes burned constantly in the ashtray. Half-finished glasses of wine dotted the table. Romy seemed trapped between two worlds. The external stage, where she still appeared radiant, and the private abyss, where grief devoured her. Professionally, she was still at her peak. In 1982, she won her second César Award for La Passante du Sans Souci, a performance so devastatingly raw that critics described it as indistinguishable from reality. She was hailed as the greatest actress of her generation. Yet the triumph felt hollow. She gave everything she had left, one colleague said. And when the cameras stopped, there was nothing more to give. Her health was failing. Years of heavy smoking and drinking had ravaged her lungs and liver. Stress etched deep lines into her face. And though she retained her haunting beauty, it was the beauty of a woman marked by tragedy. Doctors urged her to rest, to step away from work. But Romy brushed them off. She needed acting as much as she needed air. Without it, she was nothing. In May of that year, Romy moved into a small apartment in Paris's 7th arrondissement. It was meant to be a fresh start, a quieter place where she could heal. But it soon became a mausoleum of grief. She kept the curtains drawn most of the time, preferring shadows to daylight. Visitors recalled the oppressive silence, broken only by the scratch of a match as she lit another cigarette. Her daughter Sarah, just 5 years old, was the only light in those dark days. Romy clung to her with fierce devotion, trying to shield her from the storm that raged inside. But even Sarah could not save her mother from despair. Romy confessed to a close friend that she felt she was failing her daughter, that she no longer had the strength to be the mother Sarah deserved. That guilt cut her even deeper, compounding the grief of losing David with the fear of losing Sarah to her own weakness. And then, on May 29, 1982, the end came quietly. Romy Schneider was found lifeless in her bed by her partner, Laurent Pétain. She appeared peaceful, as if she had simply drifted into sleep. A half-finished glass of wine sat nearby. A cigarette smoldered in the ashtray. The world's newspapers rushed to report the news. The great Romy Schneider was dead at 43. The official cause was heart failure. Doctors insisted her body had given out under the strain of years of abuse, grief, and exhaustion. But rumors swirled almost immediately. Some believed she had taken her own life, unable to live with the weight of David's death. Others whispered of an overdose, accidental or deliberate. Her friends fiercely denied these claims, insisting Romy was too devoted to her daughter to leave her willingly. But the questions lingered, and with them, the aura of mystery that still surrounds her death. The funeral was a scene of profound sorrow. Held in France, it drew crowds of admirers, colleagues, and friends. Alain Delon, her great love and eternal confidant, carried her coffin, his face etched with grief. "You were and you will remain the love of my life," he whispered over her grave, words that would echo across decades. For Delon, Romy's death was not just the loss of a friend, but the end of an era, the extinguishing of a flame that had burned too brightly to last. Romy was buried beside her son David in Boissy-Sans-Avoir, a small village near Paris. The image of mother and son united in death became one of the most poignant symbols of her story. Visitors to the cemetery still leave flowers, notes, and tokens, as if to remind her that she has not been forgotten. In the days following her death, tributes poured in from across the world. Directors praised her as the finest actress of her generation. Critics wrote elegies to her brilliance, and fans mourned the loss of the woman who had been both a fairy tale princess and the raw embodiment of human suffering. Yet beneath the accolades, a darker truth resonated. Romy Schneider had died as she had lived torn between myth and reality. Celebrated, yet broken. Adored, yet desperately alone. Her final days remain one of the great tragedies of cinema. For all her fame, for all her talent, for all the love she inspired, Romy Schneider could not escape the ghosts that haunted her. She was a woman who had given everything to her art, but who could not find salvation in her own life. And in the end, she left behind a question that still lingers more than 4 decades later. Did Romy die of a broken heart? As the curtains closed on May 29, 1982, the world lost more than an actress. It lost a woman whose story was both a triumph and a warning. The tragedy of Romy Schneider was not just that she died too young, it was that she lived too intensely, too vulnerably, for a world that demanded perfection but offered no mercy. When Romy Schneider died in May 1982, the shock rippled across Europe and beyond. Newspapers mourned her as a lost icon. Filmmakers lamented the silencing of a voice that still had so much to give. And audiences wept for the woman who had once embodied both their dreams and their sorrows. But Romy's story did not end in that Paris apartment. In truth, her legacy only began to grow after death. Layered in equal measure with reverence, fascination, and lingering questions that no one has ever been able to answer fully. Her cinematic contributions are beyond dispute. Romy left behind a body of work that remains timeless. From the naive sparkle of Sissi to the raw despair of La Passante du Sans Souci, her career spanned nearly 3 decades of transformation. She was one of the rare actresses who managed to reinvent herself not once, but twice, moving from Austrian sweetheart to French cinematic titan. Her performances continue to be studied in film schools, her mastery of silence and subtle expression praised as the hallmark of great screen acting. To this day, critics argue that no other actress captured the fragility and strength of the modern woman with such devastating authenticity. Yet, her legacy is not merely artistic. Romy became a cultural symbol, a reflection of the contradictions of post-war Europe. Born in Vienna under the shadow of her mother's Nazi-era career, she came of age in a Germany desperate to rebuild its cultural identity. She carried the stain of history while simultaneously offering a new vision of womanhood, one that was vulnerable yet independent, fractured yet resilient. In France, she became not just an adopted star, but a national treasure, embodying the sophistication and melancholy of French cinema. Few performers so seamlessly bridged cultures, languages, and histories. Her influence extended beyond film. For many women, Romy represented the struggle of balancing public expectations with private truth. She was admired not because she was flawless, but because she allowed her flaws to seep into her art. In a world that demanded perfection, Romy showed that imperfection could be luminous, even transcendent. Generations of actresses who followed from Isabelle Adjani to Juliette Binoche have cited her as an influence, praising her courage to portray women not as ideals, but as human beings, in all their messy contradictions. And yet, what makes Romy Schneider unforgettable is not just her artistry, but the haunting tragedy that enveloped her life. Fans and biographers continue to ask, what truly killed Romy? Was it her heart, weakened by years of cigarettes, alcohol, and stress? Was it an overdose, whether accidental or intentional? Or was it something less tangible, the weight of grief, the devastation of losing her son, the emptiness fame could never fill? The official verdict of heart failure has never satisfied those who feel her death was too poetic, too entwined with her suffering to be purely physical. Her relationship with Alain Delon further complicates her legacy. Even decades after her death, Delon has spoken of her as the great love of his life, confessing that no one ever replaced her. Their romance, their friendship, their eternal bond. It has become part of the mythology of European cinema, the love story that never truly ended. Some fans view it as tragic fate, that the one man who understood her could not remain faithful, and the one woman who loved him beyond reason could never let go. Delon carrying her coffin remains one of the most indelible images of her funeral, a cinematic gesture in itself, as though their story refused to fade into silence. The unanswered questions extend to her private life. Did Romy ever truly escape the shadow of her mother's choices? Did she ever forgive herself for her marriages, for her mistakes, for the tragedies she could not prevent? Did she find moments of peace in her daughter's laughter, or was she always haunted by the absence of David? These are questions no biography, no documentary, no tribute can fully resolve. They are the questions that keep Romy alive in the imagination of those who seek to understand her. What remains undeniable is the devotion of her fans. 4 decades later, her grave in Boissy-Saint-Sauveur is still visited by admirers who leave flowers, photographs, letters, and tokens of affection. Her films continue to draw new generations who discover in her performances a truth that feels eternal. Unlike many stars whose legacies fade with time, Romy's seems to grow, nourished by the blend of beauty and tragedy that defined her. Her story has also become a cautionary tale about fame itself. Romy Schneider was not destroyed by a lack of talent or opportunity. She was destroyed by the impossible burden of carrying both public adoration and private suffering. Her life illustrates the cruelty of celebrity, how the same public that crowns you will also watch you bleed, how the same image that elevates you can imprison you forever. In Romy's case, the paradox was lethal. Adored by millions, yet left profoundly alone. And so her legacy endures, not as a tidy narrative, but as a haunting presence. She remains the girl in the crown, the woman in despair, the actress in tears, the mother broken by loss. She remains a symbol of both cinematic brilliance and human fragility. Her story is one that cannot be neatly resolved because it is not just the story of a star. It is the story of what it means to be human in a world that demands too much and gives too little. As the lights fade on her final act, one truth lingers. Romy Schneider was never just an actress. She was a life lived at full volume, a flame that burned too intensely to last. She gave the world her beauty, her talent, her vulnerability, and in return, the world gave her applause, but not the peace she longed for. The tragedy of Romy Schneider is not just that she died young, it is that she showed us, with devastating clarity, how fragile brilliance can be. Her grave bears a simple name, yet her shadow stretches across generations. And when people watch her films, when they see those luminous eyes, that trembling smile, that heartbreaking authenticity, they do not see a role. They see Romy, alive, vulnerable, unforgettable, the woman who gave everything and left behind a question that will never be answered. How do you love an icon without destroying the soul inside?